She was on her knees in the mud when they poured the bucket over her head. The entire Greystone Pack had gathered for the annual ranking ceremony, and every wolf present watched the Pack Beda's daughter tip the bucket and watched the cold gray water hit Lira Voss across the face and the back of the neck and soak into the thin gray omega service tunic she wore, and not a single wolf in the circle moved to stop it. The laughter started at the back and moved forward. Lira kept her eyes on the ground. She had learned years ago that eye contact during a humiliation was interpreted as challenge, and challenge from an omega with no wolf form on record invited a response that the mud and the cold water were a pleasant alternative to. She breathed through her nose. She kept her hands flat on her thighs. She let the water run down her back, and she let the laughter wash over her, and she did what she had been doing for 5 years inside the Greystone Pack. She survived it. What none of the wolves in that circle knew was this. The girl in the mud had stopped a full shift 3 times in the past month. Not because she could not shift. Because the last time she had allowed even a fraction of it to surface at age 14. The ground had cracked in a radius of 8 feet around her, and the 3 adult wolves who had been present had gone immediately flat to the earth in the instinctive submission posture, and not one of them had been able to explain afterward what had compelled them. She had been managing it since she was 12. Managing the tremors when her control slipped in her sleep. Managing the gold that sometimes bled into her eyes at the edges when someone pushed her too far. Managing the specific quality of her wolf, which was not the wolf of a standard omega or a standard alpha or a standard anything in the classification system the Pack Council used to organize the world. It was something older. It was something the old texts that her dead mother had hidden in a locked chest under a false floor had a name for. A name spoken in the ancient tongue that predated every current pack structure and every current alpha line by 800 years. The name translated to, the wolf from which all wolves came. The girl in the mud was not a weak omega. She was the lost queen of all werewolves. And on the day she decided she was done kneeling in the mud for people who did not know what they were kneeling over, the world of every pack in existence was going to reorganize itself around that fact. Whether they were ready or not. Subscribe, comment, like, share. Hit subscribe before you start watching this story so the next one finds you automatically. Leave a comment right now telling us what you think is going to happen to Lira. Share this with everyone who loves a Wolf Queen story. Like the video so this reaches the people who need it. Do all 4 right now and then do not move because Chapter 1 starts immediately. Chapter 1. The Girl They Made into Nothing. The Greystone Pack occupied the eastern range of the Silverback Mountains and had been doing so for 6 generations under the unbroken alpha succession of the Holt bloodline, a fact that the current alpha, Brace Holt, mentioned in almost every formal address he delivered to the pack because he considered it the most important thing about himself. Lira Voss had been a ward of the Greystone Pack since the age of 9 when both her parents died on the same night under circumstances the pack record listed as a rogue attack on the Southern Forest Road. A classification Lira had accepted at 9 because she had not yet developed the capacity for the kind of skepticism the record deserved and had filed away at 17 to examine more carefully when she had more information and more options. She was 22 now and the information was accumulating. The morning after the ranking ceremony she was up before dawn in the pack kitchen because the pack kitchen was where she spent most of her before dawn hours. Preparing the morning meal for the 240 wolves of the Greystone Pack in the company of 3 other Omega-ranked kitchen workers and the kitchen beta. A heavy-set woman named Dross who had been running the kitchen for 12 years and who managed Lira with the specific combination of dismissiveness and dependency that characterized every relationship Lira had inside the Greystone Pack. She was useful. She was not valued. These were different things, and the pack had a sophisticated capacity for holding both simultaneously. The bruise on her left cheekbone from where the bucket rim had caught her during yesterday's ceremony was the color of a storm at the edge. She had covered it with the particular combination of practiced positioning and stillness that minimized its visibility. Nobody asked about it. Nobody in the Greystone Pack asked about Lira's bruises, because asking would have implied a concern that the pack hierarchy had not authorized. She was moving through the kitchen at the specific efficient pace she had developed over 5 years of doing the same tasks in the same order in the same space when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a scent. A frequency. It came from the direction of the southern forest, from somewhere beyond the pack territory boundary. And it was carried on the early morning air with the specific quality of something that had been traveling a long distance and was only now arriving at sufficient proximity to be detected by whatever in Lira was capable of detecting it. Her hands stopped moving. Dross said, without looking up from the bread dough she was working, that the fire needed tending. Lira tended the fire. She did it with her hands because her hands remembered the sequence and her attention was on the frequency and what it was telling her. It was telling her that something was coming. Not toward the kitchen. Toward her, specifically, with the directional precision of a signal that had been aimed rather than broadcast. She had been receiving these signals for 3 years. Never strong enough to be certain they were real and not the product of a mind that had spent too long in a community that treated her as furniture. But this morning the signal was stronger than it had ever been, and it was not ambiguous. It was a summons in the old frequency, the one she had read about in her mother's hidden texts and had never heard described by any living wolf, because no living wolf she had encountered had the receiver for it. She finished the morning kitchen work, and she served the breakfast rotation, and she cleaned the preparation surfaces, and she did all of it with the outer surface of her attention while the inner surface tracked the signal getting closer and tried to understand what it meant. That something using the old frequency knew exactly where she was. The answer arrived at midday. She was in the east courtyard splitting wood, which was a task assigned to her approximately 3 times a week, not because the pack lacked stronger wolves to do it, but because it was the kind of task that the pack found satisfying to assign to her specifically. When the forest at the eastern tree line produced a wolf. Not through the main gate. Not through any of the established entry routes that pack wolves and visitors used. Through the tree line itself, which meant through territory that was technically Greystone Pack land and should have been covered by the territorial ward that the pack's senior betas maintained in rotating shifts. The ward had not stopped this wolf. It was a large male in human form, wearing the clothing of no pack she recognized, deep charcoal armor-grade material with no insignia, with silver hair worn to the jaw and eyes the color of old bronze. He was not young. He moved with the economy of someone who had been doing something difficult for a very long time and had internalized the difficulty completely. He came across the east courtyard directly toward Lira without looking at anything else in the courtyard, as if everything else in the courtyard did not register as relevant. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at her with those bronze eyes, and she looked back with the specific quality of stillness she used for everything and waited. He said, in the old tongue, the formal greeting of the first court. Lira had read that greeting in her mother's texts. She had practiced it alone in the storage room where she slept, speaking it into the dark. She had never heard it from another living person. She replied in the old tongue, her accent imperfect from reading rather than speaking, and watched something move through the silver-haired man's expression that was profound and private and not something she had a complete word for. He said his name was Soren. He said he had been looking for her for 11 years. He said her mother had sent him a message the night she died, through the old frequency, the last broadcast of a dying wolf using the final reserves of her blood to aim a single piece of information at the one person she trusted to act on it. He said, Lira Voss is alive. Find her before the pack finds out what she is. Lira set the axe against the woodpile with careful hands. She said, how much time do we have? He said, less than we did yesterday. The Greystone Alpha received a communication from the High Council this morning. Someone at the High Council has been running bloodline analyses on pack ward logs for 2 years. The pattern in your ward records is unusual. Unusual enough that they have flagged it for personal review. Lira said, they will send someone. He said, they already have. The envoy left the High Council seat 4 days ago. At standard travel pace they arrive in 3 days. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the east courtyard. She looked at the pack house that had been her cage for 5 years, and the walls that had been her horizon, and the specific texture of a life that had been carefully built around the project of her diminishment. She said, "I need 1 hour." He said he would be at the eastern tree line. She went back to work for 20 more minutes. She finished splitting the wood because leaving it half done would be noted, and noted meant questions, and questions meant delay she had not budgeted for. She stacked it. She put the axe in the tool rack. She walked to the storage room where she had slept for 5 years on a cot that was not long enough for her full height, and she opened the floorboard under the cot, and she took out the locked cedar chest that had been the only thing transferred to her keeping from her parents' effects, and she took out the texts inside it, and she put them in the pack she had been quietly assembling for 8 months, because she had known this day was coming even without knowing exactly when. She had not known when. She had known it was coming. She put on her traveling clothes, the dark brown leather and woven wool she wore for outdoor winter tasks, sturdy boots, the gloves that were worn at the knuckles and still warm. She left the gray Omega tunic on the cot. She left the storage room. She walked through the packhouse corridor, through the east door, across the east courtyard, and into the tree line without looking back. Nobody stopped her. Nobody ever watched the Omega closely enough to notice when she was going somewhere with intention rather than assignment. That had always been her best protection and her most effective weapon, and she had used both for 5 years, and she was done with both now. Soren was at the tree line. He fell into step beside her without needing to adjust his pace. They moved north through the Greystone forest, and she let the frequency in her blood do what it had been trying to do for years: open fully, cast wide, read the landscape around her in the old way that her mother's texts described as the Queen's Reach. And the forest responded to it like a body responding to the return of sensation to a limb that had been constrained for too long. She said, "Where are we going?" He said, "The first court." She said she had read about the first court. He said it still existed. It had never stopped existing. It had simply been waiting for the bloodline to produce an heir who survived long enough to come home to it. She walked north through the forest that had been her cage's edge for 5 years and felt her wolf pressing against the inside of her chest for the first time in months without suppressing it. And the wolf was not afraid, and it was not frantic, and it was not the desperate compressed energy of something that had been contained too long. It was patient. It had always been patient. It had simply been waiting for the direction that was finally, after 22 years, in front of them. Chapter 2. The Court That Never Fell. The first court was 4 days north of the Greystone Pack territory through increasingly wild forest that thinned at altitude into high alpine terrain, and then, at the specific elevation that Soren navigated by instinct and old knowledge, opened into a valley that had been protected from the sight and scent of outsiders by a ward so old it had ceased to function like a ward and had become simply the quality of the place itself. You could not find the valley unless you had the old blood, or unless you were brought by someone who did. Lira had been reading about the first court since she was 12 and had opened the cedar chest for the first time and unfolded the first of her mother's texts and sat with it in the dark of the storage room for 4 hours, understanding that the world she had been living in was a much smaller version of the world that actually existed. She had been reading about it for 10 years, but reading and arriving were different categories of experience, and she was not prepared for the arrival in the way that no amount of reading can prepare you for the actual scale of something. The valley was not empty. She had known intellectually that it would not be empty. The text described the first court as a living community, the oldest continuous werewolf settlement in existence. The community that predated every current pack structure by 8 centuries and that had maintained itself through the long centuries of the Lost Queen's absence by the specific discipline of people who believed with absolute conviction in something they could not yet see, and were willing to organize their lives around that belief anyway. Knowing that, and standing at the valley's edge looking down at 300 wolves going about the work of a community that had been functioning and waiting and preserving something for 8 centuries were different things. They felt her arrive. Not all at once. It started at the valley's edge with the wolves closest to the approach path, a ripple of reaction that moved inward through the community the way a stone's entry moves through still water. Not shock. not surprise. The specific quality of a long expectation meeting its object, the particular stillness of people who have been holding something in preparation and are now understanding that the preparation has served its purpose. Soren walked beside her into the valley, and the wolves they passed looked at her with those bronze and amber and deep green eyes that the old bloodlines produced, and she looked back with the specific steadiness that had been her only consistent possession for 22 years. She had not shifted yet. She had felt the wolf pressing all 4 days of travel, and had let it press without releasing it, partly because she was not certain what the full release would produce in the mountain terrain, and partly because she was aware that her first shift in this community should not be an accident, but a choice. She would make that choice when she understood the ground she was standing on. The court elder met them at the central building of the valley settlement, a structure built of pale stone and old timber that was large without being ostentatious, and that carried in its architecture the specific quality of something built to last rather than to impress. The elder's name was Mira, and she was the oldest wolf Lira had ever stood near. Her age visible not in physical deterioration, but in the specific density of presence that accumulates in a person who has been paying attention to the world for a very long time. Her hair was white and worn loose. Her eyes were pale gold. She looked at Lira for a long moment without speaking, and Lira let her look, and what moved through the elder's face in those seconds was something that Lira classified as the resolution of a very long question. Mira said, "You have your mother's eyes and your grandmother's jaw, and something in the way you stand that I have not seen in 22 years. She said, "Welcome home." Lira said it was the first time anyone had said that to her and meant it, and she was finding it more difficult to receive than she had expected. Mira said that was entirely reasonable. She said, "Come inside. There is a great deal to tell you, and not as much time as I would prefer to tell it in." The great deal was this. Lira's mother, Eva, had been the last recognized queen of the First Court before the night she and Lira's father were killed on the Southern Road. The kill had been ordered not by rogues, which was what the Greystone Pack record said, but by a faction within the High Council that had been working for 30 years to ensure that the ancient queen bloodline did not produce an heir who reached adulthood with the blood active and the knowledge of what they were. The rogue story had been the cover arranged by the Greystone Alpha's father, who had been in the High Council's arrangement and had taken 9-year-old Lira as a pack ward in the specific confidence that a child without parents and without knowledge of her bloodline, raised in a low-rank position that suppressed her wolf development, would either fail to express the blood at all or could be dealt with quietly when the expression became apparent. The current Greystone Alpha, Brace Holt, knew part of this. Not all of it. He knew Lira was flagged, and he knew the High Council was interested, and he had been receiving payments from the Council faction for 3 years to keep her status suppressed and her documentation incomplete. Lira sat with this information for a long time. Not because it surprised her. She had been building toward this conclusion for years from partial information and the specific logic of her own situation, and the arrival of the complete picture was more confirmation than revelation. She sat with it because the full accounting of what had been done required a full moment of acknowledgement before she moved to the question of what came next. She said, "What does the High Council faction want?" Mira said, "The old bloodline produces the only wolf that can revoke the authority of the High Council entirely. The council was established 400 years ago as a provisional governance body after the last queen was believed to have died without an heir. It was never meant to be permanent. The returning queen, by ancient charter, has the constitutional authority to dissolve it or restructure it, or simply step into the sovereign role that the council has been filling in the bloodline's absence. They have been preventing that return for 30 years because the return ends their authority." Lira said, "And the envoy they sent to the Greystone Pack." Mira said, "Will not find her there. But they will know she left, and once they know she left they will know she was warned, and once they know she was warned they will understand that the First Court is active again and that the blood has been found." She said, "Which means we have significantly less time than Soren estimated on the road." Lira said, "Then I need to learn what I should have learned growing up." Mira said, "Yes. And you need to shift." The word landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been waiting to be said. Lira said, "I have been managing the shift since I was 12. Mira said she knew. She said the management had been wise in the Greystone Pack and was no longer necessary here. She said the first Quartz Valley was built to receive the Queen's shift, and that receiving it was not something the community feared, but something it had been prepared for across 8 centuries of maintaining the capacity. She said, "When you are ready." Lira said she would like to see her room first. They gave her a room in the Quartz main building, not the storage room caught of 5 years, but a room with a real bed and a window that looked east over the valley and stone walls that had been smoothed by generations of occupation. She sat on the edge of the bed with her mother's texts in her pack and the weight of 4 days of travel and 22 years of managed survival on her shoulders, and she breathed the air of the valley, which was different from any air she had breathed before. Clean in a way that was not about altitude, but about what lived in it, the specific quality of a place where something ancient had been breathing for 800 years. Her wolf pressed. She let it. She let it come, not the full shift, but the presence, the full weight of it present in her chest rather than compressed below the surface, and the room registered it in the way of rooms in places where the old blood has been expected and prepared for, with a warmth that was not temperature and a quality of welcome that was not social. She was going to need every piece of what she was. She had spent 22 years managing what she was so that the people around her would not be frightened by it. She was done with that management. She was going to learn to use it. She laid down on the real bed in the first court, and she slept for 12 hours, and her wolf ran through her dreams for the first time in 5 years without her pulling it back before it woke her. In the morning she went to Mira and she said she was ready. Chapter 3. The First Shift of the Lost Queen. They held the shift ceremony in the high meadow above the valley. Not because the shift required ceremony, Mira explained, but because the first court had maintained the ceremony for 8 centuries as a way of keeping the knowledge alive. The knowledge of what the Queen's shift looked like and what it meant and what it asked of the community that witnessed it. 300 wolves came to the high meadow in the morning and arranged themselves in the old formation, the same formation described in the earliest texts in the court library, a wide spiral that began at the meadow's edge and wound inward to leave the center open. Lira stood at the center. She was wearing the first court clothing that had been laid out for her before dawn. Not the gray omega tunic of the Greystone Pack. Deep midnight blue and dark silver, close-fitted and structured, the ceremonial clothing of the first court that had been maintained in the court's keeping for 22 years in the specific confidence that there would come a morning when someone needed to wear it. High boots of dark leather. A long outer coat of midnight blue that moved with her. She looked like nobody she had ever been allowed to be before. Mira stood at the edge of the center clearing and said the formal words of the shift witness in the old tongue. Lira listened to them and her wolf listened to them, and the meadow was very still with the cold morning air and the quality of 300 wolves holding themselves in absolute attention. Then Mira said, "Whenever you are ready." Lira took one breath. She let go of everything she had been holding. Not the way she had been carefully releasing fractions of it in the forest at night over the years, measured and controlled and always with one hand on the containment. She let go of all of it. Every layer of suppression. Every managed breath. Every deliberate compression of the thing that lived inside her that was ancient and enormous and had been patient for 22 years. The meadow responded first. The ground moved. Not violently. A deep resonant shift like the earth taking a breath, the specific physical response of terrain to the presence of the old blood expressing itself fully for the first time. A pulse that moved outward from where Lira stood and was felt by every wolf in the spiral formation as a pressure through the soles of their feet and a frequency through their chests that bypassed the ears entirely and went directly to the part of them that was wolf before it was anything else. Every wolf in the meadow went still. Then the shift came. It was not the standard shift that pack wolves produced, the sequential transformation from human to wolf form that followed the known biological architecture of the change. It was something that the old texts attempted to describe and that no text Lira had read had successfully conveyed until she experienced it from the inside. It was simultaneous. Both forms present at once, for one full second, the human and the wolf occupying the same space in the same moment before the wolf became the dominant expression and the human form resolved into it. And in that 1 second, the 300 wolves in the high meadow saw something that their grandparents had passed down in memory and their grandparents' grandparents had passed down before that. The specific visual of the queen's dual presence, both forms visible, both real, neither subordinate. Then the wolf was fully present. She was white. Not pale or silver or the near white of certain alpha bloodlines. White the way new snow is white before anything has touched it, complete and absolute, and carrying in that completeness a quality of light that seemed to come from inside the coat rather than reflecting off its surface. She was large in the way the old texts described, larger than any standard wolf and larger than any alpha wolf, and in a different category of large than either, the size of something that existed in a different tier of the hierarchy. Not bigger than other wolves the way a large alpha was bigger, but larger in the way that a mountain is larger than a hill, a difference of kind rather than degree. Her eyes were gold. Not amber. Not yellow. The specific deep gold of very old metal worked by hands that understood what they were making. She stood in the center of the meadow and she breathed. The first court wolves in the spiral formation went to their knees. Not because they had been instructed to. Not because the ceremony required it. Because the specific signal that came from the white wolf in the center of the meadow bypassed every layer of conscious decision-making and went directly to the wolf nature in each of them, and the wolf nature said, without ambiguity or nuance, "This is what you were made from. This is the source." Mira was the last to kneel. She knelt with the careful deliberateness of a very old wolf performing a very significant act, and when her knee touched the meadow grass, she looked at the white wolf with those pale gold eyes, and she said in the old tongue, "There you are." Lira held the shift for a full hour. She explored the dimensions of it the way you explore a room you have been locked out of for your entire life, carefully at first, and then with increasing confidence as the boundaries revealed themselves not as constraints, but as the natural shape of what she was. The queen's reach was fully open in the shift, and the valley below was present to her senses as a complete picture, every wolf, every structure, every animal in the forest at the valley's edge, every variation in the wind across the high meadow. She shifted back. The return to human form was as immediate as the shift had been, both forms present for 1 second and then the human dominant. And she stood in the center of the meadow in her midnight blue and dark silver clothing with the cold morning air on her face and 300 wolves rising from their knees around her. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Soren, standing at the outer edge of the spiral, said, "The High Council's envoy reached the Greystone Pack 3 hours ago. The meadow absorbed this. What happens next is that I go to the High Council." The meadow went quiet with the specific quality of quiet that descends when someone has said the thing that changes the direction of everything. Mira said, "That is not the approach I would have recommended." Lira said, "I know." She said, "They spent 30 years trying to prevent this. They killed my parents for it. They paid the Greystone Alpha to keep me suppressed. They sent an envoy to pick me up before I understood what I was. And now the bloodline has expressed and the first court is active, and there is nothing they can do to reverse those facts. The question is whether I let them spend the next 10 years in defensive action while I build a political coalition, or whether I go to the seat of their authority and demonstrate that the charter they have been governing under for 400 years does not give them the power they have been using." She said, "I choose the second option." She said, "I choose it because my mother spent the last seconds of her life using the final reserves of her blood to send a message that found Soren, that found me after 11 years, and I am not going to honor that by being cautious in a valley while they reorganize." Mira looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother would have made the same choice." She said, "You will need to understand the charter law before you arrive." Lira said she had been reading the texts for 10 years. She would need 2 more days. Mira said, 2 days. "And you will not go alone." Lira said she was aware of that. She looked at Soren. He said, "Obviously. This story is not done with you yet. Do not go anywhere. Subscribe and leave a comment and tell us what you think of Lira. Has a werewolf story ever hit you like this before? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a heroine who was buried alive by the people around her and came back wearing their fear like a crown. Like the video. Comment your favorite moment. Share it everywhere you can. Every one of those actions keeps this story alive. Subscribe. Like. Comment. Share. Chapter 4. The Council that did not know it was already over. The High Council seat occupied a plateau in the center range of the Silverback Mountains, 3 days from the First Court Valley at the pace Lira and her company traveled, which was the pace of a queen who had decided she was not arriving quietly and was therefore not attempting to arrive quickly. She brought 12 wolves from the First Court. Soren. Mira, who had said she had not traveled to the council seat in 40 years and was not going to miss this. 8 First Court warriors in the dark armor of the court's formal guard, the armor that had not been worn in 22 years and had been maintained in the court armory against the day it would be needed. And 2 court scholars who Lira wanted with her for the charter documentation. The High Council seat was a significant structure. It had been built 300 years ago with the specific intention of communicating the permanence and authority of the governance body it housed, all pale stone and formal towers and the specific architectural language of an institution that wants you to feel small as you approach it. The entrance road climbed the plateau face for half a kilometer through a gauntlet of formal statuary and carved stone representing the council's history and authority. Lira walked up the entrance road in her midnight blue and dark silver First Court formal clothing with the 12 First Court wolves behind her, and she did not feel small. The council had been notified of her approach 2 days earlier, because she had sent notification 2 days earlier. Not because she needed to announce herself, but because arriving without announcement would have allowed the council to frame her arrival as irregular, and she was not giving them any framing she had not authorized. They had sent no response to the notification. She had expected that. The council chamber was the central room of the council seat building, a circular space with the 12 council seats arranged in an elevated ring around a lower central floor. The architecture was designed to ensure that whoever stood in the center floor was looking up at the council rather than across at them. The effect worked on most visitors. It was the kind of design that assumed the person in the center floor had come to petition rather than to govern. Lira walked to the center floor and stood on it and looked up at the 11 council members present, noting the empty 12th seat and filing that information for later. The council head was a wolf named Aldrich, pale-haired and in his late 60s, with the specific quality of composed authority that came from decades of occupying a position nobody had challenged with any effectiveness. He looked at Lira with eyes that were doing several things simultaneously, assessing her presentation, calculating her support, measuring the distance between what he had known was coming for 2 days and the reality of her in the room. He said, "Lira Voss." She said, "Lira of the First Court." The documentation for bloodline confirmation has been submitted to the council record under Charter Article 9. I expect it has been reviewed in the 2 days since notification. Aldrich said the council was still in the process of evaluating the documentation. She said, "Then I will proceed on the basis of what the documentation demonstrates while the evaluation continues." Under Charter Article 14, a confirmed blood heir of the founding line has the right to address the council in full session before any determination of council authority is made. I am exercising that right. The council chamber was very quiet. The Charter Article 14 provision had not been invoked in 400 years. Its existence in the Charter was generally treated as a historical artifact by the contemporary council, a provision included in the founding document to cover a circumstance that was understood to no longer be relevant. Aldrich said, "The floor is yours." He said it with the specific tone of a man buying time. Lira said, "The High Council was established by provisional charter 400 years ago following the apparent extinction of the founding bloodline. The Charter's Article 1 establishes the Council's authority as provisional and conditional. Provisional in the sense that it was always intended as a temporary governance structure, and conditional in the sense that its authority is explicitly subordinate to the founding bloodline should the bloodline return. This is not my interpretation of the Charter. This is the Charter's own language, preserved in the original documents that the court scholars beside me have authenticated this morning. She said, "The bloodline has returned." She said, "The High Council's provisional authority expires at the moment of that return." This is not a political position. It is the constitutional fact established by the document under which the council was formed and has governed for 400 years. A council member to Aldrich's left said, "The bloodline confirmation has not been formally validated by this council." Lira said, "The charter does not require council validation of bloodline confirmation. It requires bloodline expression witnessed by 3 or more First Court members of standing, which occurred in the High Meadow of the First Court Valley 2 days ago in front of 300 witnesses. The documentation submitted to the council record includes sworn statements from 12 of those witnesses, including the court elder. Council validation is not a charter requirement. It is a custom the council developed at some point in the last 400 years and presented as procedure. Custom is not law and the charter is the law." Aldrich said, "This council has governed effectively for 400 years. The transition you are describing is not something that can be managed in a single chamber session." Lira said, "I agree. I am not asking for a single chamber session transition. I am establishing the constitutional fact of the bloodline's return and the consequent change in governance authority. What happens next in terms of practical transition is a matter I am prepared to negotiate with this body in good faith over a reasonable period of time." She said, "What is not negotiable is the constitutional fact itself." A council member in the far seat said, "And if this council does not accept your constitutional claim?" Lira looked at the far seat. She said, "Then I will demonstrate the claim in the way the Charter provides for in Article 17, which is the provision that covers the circumstance where a legitimate authority is refused recognition by a provisional body that has exceeded its mandate." The chamber was quiet. Mira, standing behind Lira, said softly, "They will not have memorized Article 17. Lira said to the council, "Article 17 provides that a blood heir denied recognition has the right to establish recognition through the old proof, which is the demonstration of the founding blood's authority in its physical expression before council witnesses. The Charter specifies that the old proof cannot be refused once invoked, and that its outcome is binding without appeal." She said, "I am invoking Article 17. She did not wait for a response. She shifted. The council chamber was not the High Meadow. It was a stone room with a vaulted ceiling and 12 council members in elevated seats and 12 First Court wolves on the lower floor, and the specific enclosed quality of a room that had never been designed to contain what was now inside it. The White Wolf stood on the center floor and looked up at the council ring. The effect of the Queen's signal in an enclosed space was considerably more immediate than it had been in the open meadow. The old frequency was not amplified by the walls, but it was focused, and the 12 council members in their elevated seats received it without the diffusion that open air would have provided. Every council member went immediately still. Not choice. The wolf nature in each of them, operating below conscious decision, received the signal from the White Wolf on the center floor and executed the same response that the First Court wolves had executed in the meadow. The involuntary recognition of the source frequency, the deep instinctive acknowledgement of the thing from which all wolf nature came. Aldrich's hands were flat on the arms of his seat. His face was doing something that was not composure. Lira held the shift for 2 minutes. She let them sit with it. Then she shifted back and stood on the center floor in her midnight blue and dark silver and looked up at the council and said, "That is the old proof. The Charter specifies its outcome is binding without appeal." She said, "I am prepared to begin transition discussions at whatever pace the Council finds manageable. I am not prepared to pretend the constitutional fact is open to question." Aldrich looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "The empty 12th seat belonged to the council member who authorized the mission to the Greystone Pack to retrieve you before your expression could be established." He said, "That member resigned from the council this morning." He said, "That should tell you something about what 11 of the 12 members believe the outcome of this session was going to be." Lira said, "It tells me that 11 of the 12 members are people I can work with." Aldrich looked at her with an expression that was no longer composed authority and was instead the specific expression of someone encountering a force that is simply larger than the category they have been using to process it. He said, "Your mother was like this." Lira said, "I know. I grew up on her texts." He said, "She would have been very proud of you." The chamber held that for a moment. Then Lira said, "I would like to discuss the transition framework. I understand there are 11 of you and 1 of me and a great deal of institutional knowledge sitting in those seats that I need. I am not interested in dismantling what has been built. I am interested in building something better on the foundation of what the Charter actually intended." She said, "But first I would like someone to tell me who the 12th member worked with and how far the network they built to suppress my bloodline actually extends, because that is the part of this situation that I need to understand completely before I can trust any of the rest of it." Aldrich said, "That is exactly the right question." He said, "Sit down. This is going to take a while." Chapter 5. What comes after? The transition took 6 months. Not because the constitutional question was unresolved. The old proof had settled that with a finality that the Charter had been designed to make impossible to dispute and that Aldrich and the remaining 11 council members had accepted with the specific mixture of relief and adjustment that characterized people who had been managing a provisional arrangement for a long time and found the arrival of its intended conclusion more welcome than they had anticipated. The 6 months were required because the network the 12th council member had built to suppress the founding bloodline across 30 years was extensive and embedded and needed to be mapped completely before it could be addressed. And because the practical transition of governance authority from a 12-member council to a single sovereign with a supporting court required the development of structures that did not yet exist. And because Lira was 22 and had been running a pack kitchen for 5 years and had a great deal to learn before she was ready to govern effectively, and she was not interested in governing before she was ready. She said this to Aldrich in their 3rd working session, when he had been pushing for a faster formal installation timeline. She said, "I have been waiting 22 years. 2 more months of preparation will not diminish the result and will significantly improve it. I am not in a hurry because the outcome is not in question." The outcome was not in question the moment I walked into this chamber. Aldrich said she sounded like her mother. She said she considered that the highest compliment he had given her. The investigation into the suppression network produced 11 names across 6 pack territories, including the Greystone Alpha, Brace Holt, who received formal notification of his removal from Alpha status under the Charter's provision for pack leaders found to be operating in violation of founding law. His response to the notification involved 3 days of formal objection and then a quiet capitulation when the first court warriors arrived at the Greystone Pack's eastern gate with documentation that made the outcome of any continued objection entirely clear. Lira was not present for that particular moment. She considered it, but decided that her presence at the Greystone Pack's gate would have been the kind of personal satisfaction that was not worth the political reading it would invite. She was going to be sovereign of all werewolves. She could not also be the girl settling a personal account. Those were 2 different roles, and she was choosing the first. She was not without satisfaction. She simply took it in the form of the formal investigation report rather than the personal confrontation. Soren said she was making the right choice. She said she knew. She said, "It does not feel as good as I thought it would." He said, "That is because the part that matters was never the accounting. The part that matters was the 5 years you survived inside that pack while being something that should have terrified them, and surviving it without becoming the kind of person who needs to watch someone be afraid of them before they feel safe." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "My mother's text said something like that." He said, "Your mother understood the difference between power and the performance of power. You inherited that understanding." The man who arrived at the first court valley on the 43rd day of the transition period was not someone Lira had been expecting. His name was Kindus Fall, and he was the alpha of the Northwatch Pack, the largest pack in the Northern Territories at 460 wolves. And he arrived not with a diplomatic envoy or a formal delegation, but alone on horseback with a letter of introduction from Aldrich and the specific quality of someone who had made a decision that cost him something and was arriving in the aftermath of that cost. He was 30 years old, and he had dark red hair worn short, and eyes the color of deep forest in early morning, and he moved through the first court valley with the careful awareness of someone who understood that they were in a place where the usual metrics did not apply. Mira brought him to the main building. Lira was at the stone table with 3 texts and 2 court scholars working through governance charter language when he came in, and she looked up from the texts with the specific expression of someone whose focus has been interrupted and who is in the process of deciding whether the interruption is warranted. He held the interruption. He said, "I am the Alpha of the Northwatch Pack. I have been the Alpha of the Northwatch Pack for 4 years. 3 weeks ago, the Pack Council held a formal session and produced a resolution asking me to come here and offer the Northwatch Pack's formal recognition of the founding bloodline's return and to ask whether there was any form of service the Northwatch Pack could offer to the court during the transition period." He said, "That is the official purpose of my visit." He said, "The unofficial purpose of my visit is that I read the old proof record when it was circulated to the Pack Alphas, and I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I wanted to understand whether the person described in the record was the same as the person actually in the room." Lira looked at him. She said, "And?" He said, "You are considerably more present in person than the record suggests. The record describes what you did. It does not describe what it is like to be in the same room with you." She said, "Most records have that limitation." He said, "Yes. But this one left out more than most." Mira, standing at the room's edge, had the expression of someone who was paying very close attention and finding the attention satisfying. Lira said, "The Northwatch Pack's recognition is accepted and appreciated. In terms of service during the transition, the most useful thing any pack can offer is accurate and complete information about the suppression network's reach into their territory and their governance. Because the investigation is not yet complete and I need the picture to be complete before I can build on the foundation." He said, "I have documentation. It is on my horse." She said, "Get it." He got it. He came back with a document case that contained material the investigation had not yet reached, names and transactions and correspondence that filled 3 specific gaps in the network map that had been frustrating the scholars for 2 weeks. Lira spent the rest of the afternoon working through it with the scholars, and Candace Fall sat at the other end of the stone table and answered questions when asked and did not offer information that was not requested, which was the behavior of someone who understood the difference between being useful and being present for his own benefit. At the end of the working session, she said, "You are welcome to stay for the evening meal." He said he would like that. He stayed for 3 days. He returned 4 weeks later with a second document case and a formal letter from the Northwatch Pack Council extending the recognition period indefinitely. Soren observed this development with the specific expression of someone who was not saying anything they were thinking because they had concluded that not saying it was the more strategically sound choice. Mira observed it with considerably less restraint. Lira said to Mira, "I am in the middle of a governance transition." Mira said, "Your grandmother met your grandfather in the middle of a war. The First Court has always had an appreciation for inconvenient timing." Lira said, "He is a Pack Alpha with his own governance responsibilities." Mira said, "The Charter has always contemplated the possibility of a consort who maintains an independent governing role. The founding documents are quite thorough on the subject." Lira looked at her. Mira looked back with those pale gold eyes and the expression of someone who has been waiting for 80 years and considers 800 years of institutional knowledge to be an entirely reasonable foundation for an opinion. She said, "You have been managing what you are for 22 years, so that the people around you would not be frightened by it." She said, "Candace Fall is not frightened by it." She said, "That is rarer than you have been in a position to understand until now." Lira sat with that. She sat with it in the way she sat with things that were significant and deserved more than a passing assessment, with the full attention she had been developing since she was 12 and teaching herself to manage something enormous in a small storage room on a cot that was too short for her. The formal installation ceremony was held at the First Court Valley on the 6th month of the transition, attended by representatives from every pack in the 6 territories and by the 11 remaining High Council members and by 300 First Court wolves and by the Northwatch Alpha who stood at the valley edge and watched the ceremony with the specific quality of attention of someone who is both personally and institutionally invested in the outcome and has stopped trying to pretend. Those 2 categories of investment are separate. Mira placed the old crown on Lira's head. Not a metal crown. The First Court's crown was living, woven from the branches of the oldest tree in the valley forest. A crown that grew in specific response to the founding blood and that had been growing since the night Lira's mother died and sending out the specific shoots that indicated an active heir since Lira first opened her mother's texts at age 12. It settled on her dark hair as if it had been built for exactly the circumference of this head. Because it had. The 300 First Court wolves knelt. The pack representatives knelt. The council members knelt. Mira said, in the old tongue, the words of the queen's acknowledgement, the words that had not been said by a court elder to a living queen in 22 years, and the valley received them the way valleys receive significant things, by holding them in the air after the sound has stopped so that they continue to exist past their speaking. Lira stood in the center of the valley in her midnight blue and dark silver with the living crown in her dark hair, and looked out at the wolves kneeling around her, and felt her wolf standing fully upright in her chest for the first time in her life, with no suppression, and no management, and no carefully maintained containment. Just present. Just itself. Just the thing it had always been, patient and ancient and enormous, waiting for the girl in the mud to decide she was done kneeling. In the Greystone Pack, the East Courtyard woodpile was split and stacked by a rotating team of volunteers who had organized the task share after the Alpha's removal because nobody had assigned the work to any particular wolf and the task simply needed doing. The storage room at the back of the pack house was empty. The gray Omega tunic was gone. And in the First Court Valley, the queen of all werewolves sat at the stone table with the Northwatch Alpha and a document case between them, and the scholars had long since gone to bed, and the evening had gone from late to very late, and neither of them had noticed. Soren passed the window on his nightly perimeter walk and did not stop walking. He was smiling. He had spent 11 years looking for this girl. He had found a queen. That is the story of Lira Voss. The Omega who spent 5 years in a pack kitchen surviving the deliberate diminishment of people who had no idea what they were standing next to. The wolf who managed the rarest blood in 8 centuries so that nobody would be frightened of her, for people who were not worth a single day of that management. The queen who walked into the High Council and dissolved 400 years of provisional governance in an afternoon using a charter that the council itself had been operating under without reading it carefully enough. If this story moved you, then do these 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment and tell us your favorite moment in this story. Share it with every person who deserves a wolf queen who is never defeated, only waiting. Like the video so this story reaches the people who need it. Subscribe, like, comment, share.